Hi, my name is Andrigo Noella. Welcome back to the Burn Bag Podcast. Today we have a very interesting episode, an episode that you may think is covering a very niche topic, but has broader implications for the war in Ukraine and the broader sense of how we consider our global order. Joining me here today is Dr. Greta Uehling. She is a cultural anthropologist and humanitarian working at the intersection of Indigenous studies and Eastern European studies. I'm happy to say that she's also a University of Michigan professor. I believe my old co-host Ryan Rosenthal may have taken a class with her. He was a big Russian studies person. He's now with the government, but hopefully he'll come back sometime. But Dr. Euling's new book, Decolonizing Ukraine, is the first major ethnography focused on the Crimean Tatar people since the 2014 occupation of the peninsula. So this book is based on around 150 interviews, including 90 with displaced Crimean Tatars. The book offers a rare, intimate look at how these people are reshaping not just their own, but their whole nation and region's identity, the issues of cultural memory, and then resistance under Russian rule and occupation. Dr. Yuling, thanks so much for joining me here today. I really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Dr. Euling, I want to, give our audience sort of a 1 hour 101 on who the Crimean Tatars are, basically. A lot of people in our general audience may not have heard of them. They have had a long presence in the area. So, I'd love to sort of ask you first, you've spent years listening to the voices of those affected by the conflict in Ukraine. Uh, as background, what first led you to Crimea, and why has Crimea been such a central focus of your work?
Mm-hmm. Well, I got interested through an elective, through language and culture, right? I think it's sort of the gateway drug for a lot of people into
Mhm.
studying a particular part of the world. And so I took a course on the literature, and then found myself going to Ukraine as part of a study abroad program. And something that really, so I was sent to Ukraine to learn Russian. And like to today's ears, that will be obviously problematic. But back then, um, it was really sort of a mystery to me why these Russians and Ukrainians who shared this East Slavic heritage were not getting along at all. And of course, once I started to do research into this topic, I realized that the Soviet international project had uh, created a lot of nationalism, and Russia's historic oppression of Ukrainians and their discrimination against Ukrainians had led to a great deal of resentment and tension between these two groups. So, as I embarked on my graduate career, I knew that I wanted to study something to do with the politics of ethnicity in the former Soviet Union. And I came upon the story of the Crimean Tatars and was very moved because their story is, fundamentally one about resilience. They survived two ethnic cleansings, and um, one has been called deemed a genocide by the government of Ukraine, and I think that their story is really illustrates like the pathologies of the Soviet system, the pathologies of the state system, but it's really their incredible creativity and resilience that have kept me interested all these years because, of course, it raises the question, well, why are they so resilient? How are they so resilient? And in the book, I talk about it as like the alchemy of adversity, right? Like it's
Yeah.
precisely this oppression that has forced them to be very creative.
Gotcha. So, I mean, before we sort of dive into who they are, I'd love to sort of get a sense of, how do you define indigeneity? Because again, a lot of folks who may be hearing about quote, indigenous people in Ukraine may not generally have thought about that sort of topic, right? Like we often think about indigenous people in the context of North America, right? You have the Native Americans, you have the white Europeans coming in, colonizing, and it's sort of an easy differential. But for a lot of people, they may hear this, right? And they may think like, oh, wait, so like then what are the rest of the Ukrainian people? What is the ethnography of that? Like who are the Crimean Tatars and so on. So I'd love for you to sort of give us a sense of, in this context, what does it mean to be indigenous to Crimea or to Ukraine?
Of course. According to the UN definition of Indigenous people, they are descended from pre-colonial ancestors, have endured political and economic marginalization, and remain vulnerable to um, more politically dominant groups. And so I think of Indigenous status in this context as um, more than an ethnic identity. It is also a legal category that potentially stands to offer Ukraine a framework going forward for dealing with issues of historic human rights abuses, structural violence, and imbalances in power.
Hmm.
And so a lot of people confuse the term indigenous with like first people.
Yeah.
And it's not really about firstness. It's not who was here first, because if you go into firstness, there will always be, uh, another group that was there before. That's not the point, right? It is very much a human rights uh, status, and in the context of Crimea today, a good way to think about it is they were once over 90% of the population of the peninsula.
Oh, wow.
There were virtually no Ukrainians in Crimea until the Soviet project brought them there. Right. So the international legal justification for Crimea remaining part of Ukraine is law, right? It's international law. Ukraine is a sovereign state. Crimea is part of Ukraine, therefore Crimea should remain part of Ukraine. That's the international legal justification. But there's also a moral argument to be made that this group um, originated on that territory, had statehood for 300 years. They established a state in 1483. Because they were over 90% of the population, their language was the lingua franca. And the only reason that changed was first Russian imperial colonization in 1780s, and then the Soviet project of population relocation, famine, and ultimately the deportation. And then eventually the policies of independent Ukraine post 1991, when independent Ukrainian authorities chose not to include Crimean Tatars in the processes of like the privatization of property that were ongoing at the time, under the rationale that the Crimean Tatars hadn't been there.
Hmm.
And the only reason that they weren't there was that they had been forcibly removed.
Gotcha.
Right. So you can
Yeah.
begin to see how it's about human rights more than the color of your skin or the language that you speak or your like ethnic identification.
Gotcha. And you said they used to make up about 90% of Crimea. So how do the Crimean Tatars basically define themselves? How do they define their connection to Crimea, not just geographically, but spiritually, culturally, politically, and even economically?
Mm. Hmm. I think if you ask a Crimean Tatar that question, they would say, we formed as a group on this land. This land is part of our body, right? Like we are made of this soil. We are this clay. And although Crimea is home to many, many different peoples and groups over the ages, we have no other homeland, right?
Hmm.
Greeks, Bulgarians, Germans, Ukrainians, Russians, they all have other homelands elsewhere. We're the group that has no other place to call home.
Gotcha. So when we think about the Crimean Tatars sort of like, in terms of an ethnography, like are they similar to sort of what we think of as like Eastern Europeans, Western Europeans, Turkic people, like who are they basically in sort of that context, that sense?
Mm-hmm. You know, I think that if you looked like genetically, they would be
Yeah.
comprised of many different people. And the way they took shape was, Europeans like Genoese and Greeks and Venetians came to Crimea from the south through the ocean. And then Turkic nomadic groups came into Crimea from the north, and they blended, right? And so they're a combination of all of these people comprising a unique mix, unified by their time together on the peninsula, and also that they are Sunni Islam and they speak a Turkic language that is probably closest to like Istanbul Turkish. It's close to Turkish, so they speak a Turkic language and they're Sunni Muslim.
Gotcha. That's super interesting. I did not know this at all, actually. So, now I'm sort of curious, in the present day, since 2014, since the Russian occupation of Crimea began in 2014, what kinds of pressure or repression have the Crimean Tatars experienced on the ground?
Ooh, uh, the Russian backed authorities of Crimea have disproportionately targeted them for arrest, imprisonment, torture, disappearance. So they've made some aspects of their religion against the law, and that means that they can drive up to a mosque, arrest every person in that mosque, and they do a lot of profiling. And for you to understand what I mean by disproportionate, um, of the political prisoners in Russia today, two-thirds of them, according to Kharkiv Human Rights Group, are believed to be Crimean Tatar. So this is a group that comprises approximately 12% of the population of Crimea today, and yet they comprise over two-thirds of the prison population of politically motivated imprisonment. Another dimension of this is um, disproportionately being targeted for conscription into the Russian military. And then there is the daily moral injuries of being heavily discriminated against as Crimean Tatar, because they have uh, throughout their history been loyal to the Ukrainian state, not the Russian state, precisely because of their historic experiences. So right away, Russia looks at them as potentially disloyal to Russia. And so it's even the basic human right of like bodily integrity is not observed. We're talking about home searches in the early morning, confiscation of electronic equipment, um, being brought in for questioning. It's a very, very difficult situation.
Wow. I mean, like, when we're talking about, the occupation, obviously there is also resistance, there is resilience. What do those two things look like in that type of environment under occupation, especially when so much of that is actually invisible to the outside world. Like, I mean, you're not hearing a lot of people talk about this group of people, about the type of tribulations that they are facing. You know, we're talking about Crimea sort of in general, but we often don't talk about the actual people.
Hmm. Hmm. Resilience for Crimean Tatars shows up in the realm of culture and language. And you might think that this is just too subtle, right? But for a group that had their literature, their language and culture suppressed, even their ethnonym, Crimean Tatar, was suppressed. For them to continue to call themselves Crimean Tatars and practice their culture, teach their children their language, um, is a form of resilience. And so, since the 2014 occupation by Russia, there has been a true flowering of Crimean Tatar culture in the form of embroidery classes, films, poetry, novels, new NGOs, cultural exchanges with Crimean Tatars in other parts of the world. So the arts and culture have really flourished, and that is a real source of resilience for them. And then you also mentioned uh, resistance,
Mhm.
and I think that their resistance comes in with um, the process that I really chart in Decolonizing Ukraine, whereby they have become much more socially and politically visible in government controlled parts of Ukraine, so that they have become real leaders in the process of thinking about um, the deoccupying currently occupied territories. They've assumed very important political positions. For example, a former political prisoner, Nariman Jalal, was recently appointed to be Ukraine's ambassador to Turkey. So we're talking about a person who, while living in Crimea, was educating people about the human rights situation in Crimea, was arrested and imprisoned by Russian authorities for simply, making statements that anywhere else in the world would just simply be considered principled, given a 17-year prison sentence, and then he was released in a prisoner swap and became the ambassador. Similar stories for people in other positions in the Ukrainian government. So I think it's a very important process because historically, Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars did not see themselves as allies. In fact, in most of the literature on Eastern Europe, they're arch enemies
Hmm.
because the Crimean Tatars were famous for like raiding Ukrainian steppe lands. And so they were a source of grief and sorrow in this area known as the Wild Fields. And so the question arises, how did a group that had been demonized and vilified literally for centuries remake their national narrative and find a pathway to far greater unity with other Ukrainians so that they now identify with the same set of values. And, the cover of the book kind of dramatizes the fact that, they both, um, so this is T is from the Tatar flag, and then this is like the plant motifs that they share, having like cohabitated in this southern steppe region for centuries, right? They discovered each other after the 2014 Russian occupation of Crimea. So they discovered that like a melody that they thought was only theirs could also be heard in the other group's music, or a plant motif found in embroidery that they thought was solely theirs was found with a slightly different meaning in the other group's embroidery, or customs like social customs around visiting, marriages, births were shared. They discovered each other, and most importantly, I think they discovered that um, the value that they placed on freedom was overarching and all encompassing, right? And that became something to rally behind and galvanize them to work together to resist Russian domination.
Wow, no, that's an incredible story, I think, of just, as you said, these two groups finding each other. Now I'd like to sort of take a step back into the 20th century, sort of focusing on Stalin's deportations, the displacement that they had faced, nearly a century ago, really. I mean, Stalin started right in like 1929 or so. Can you tell us a little bit more about that historical trauma they faced under Stalin? And then how does that trauma shape how they view the current crisis?
Yeah, so under the Stalinist regime, there was a real concern about um, maintaining the loyalty of the Soviet population. And what happened in Crimea during World War II is that, like huge swaths of Ukraine, it was occupied. It was occupied by the forces of the Third Reich, German and Romanian Third Reich
Mhm.
forces for 3 years. And that began a very difficult time in the history of, of Crimea because when Soviet forces were able to clear Crimea of the Third Reich, they accused the Crimean Tatars of having collaborated with the Nazi forces. Now, these are bogus charges because any actual collaborators retreated with the German army. The people that they accused of collaboration were essentially women, children, and the elderly, right? The people who hadn't gone off to fight in the Soviet army against, in World War II. And so that's largely who was deported on May 18th, 1944. In the course of a single night, the entire population heard knocks on their door in the early morning hours. They were given 15 minutes to prepare, and then they were taken in cars to the train stations where they were loaded into cattle cars and went on a journey that lasted um, between 2 and 3 weeks. There was no place to go to the bathroom. They were primarily standing. Um, the dead had to be tossed out of the cars, never to be, not to receive a dignified burial. And they were spread across Soviet Central Asia and the Ural Mountains, where they some of them were interned in like these basically like a concentration camp. It was called the Special Settlement Regime, where they did labor. They were not allowed to leave the camp, and um, they were told that they could no longer refer to themselves as Crimean Tatars, that they could no longer speak about Crimea, even if it was to laud the peninsula's tremendous beauty, and that they were basically slated for assimilation with the people in the places that they were delivered. Meanwhile, back in Crimea, um, it's important to understand that every single living Crimean Tatar was removed.
What was the population size, just to give our audience a sense of context, scale, and so on?
It was a couple 100,000 people, and at that time, I believe they were about a third of the population
Wow.
of Crimea. So, so back in Crimea, they've been removed down to the last person. Their place names are changed. Their books, their gravestones are used to pave roads and form the structure of public toilet walls. Their mosques are turned into storage facilities or movie theaters, and they're essentially erased from that landscape.
It's a cultural genocide, basically, right?
Yes. And we should also mention that the conditions of the deportation were so brutal that um, a great many perished in the process, either in the trains or from malnutrition, dehydration, and disease upon arrival. So, estimates vary how many people actually perished, but sort of a midline guess is that, somewhere around 20%. Like a Crimean Tatar might say almost half of us perished. An encyclopedia entry might come in lower than 20. But basically, there was a massive death toll. And to my point, like they were treated as subhuman. They were treated as not as human beings.
Was there ever any like coordinated like killing or massacre of the Crimean Tatars by the Soviet regime, or was it mainly sort of geared towards deportations?
The deportation was kind of the you could say it was like the nadir of their relationship with um, Russian and Soviet authorities. However, before then and since then, there was a practice of um, really singling out the most talented, like the leaders, right? The intellectuals, the people who had talents of political leadership or artistic leadership, singling them out. So there's lots of examples throughout Crimean Tatar history, like of leaders who would rise to the top and then, basically be murdered because that represented a threat to Russian or Soviet authority in the region.
Gotcha. So when you talk to, Crimean Tatars right now, are there differences in how the older generations and the younger generations talk about Crimea, their own identity, or their sense of belonging?
I think that different generations share a very deep sense of belonging to the Crimean Peninsula. And that's a little bit different than the Crimean Peninsula belonging to them, right? Because they have a very indigenous worldview whereby land is not a resource, but a responsibility. And they belong to Crimea because it's where their ancestors' graves are, and it's what their parents and grandparents struggled to reclaim for them, right? Because once they're deported to Central Asia and the Urals, they were not allowed to repatriate until after the Soviet Union disintegrated, and that too entailed significant hardship because the Ukrainian authorities of then, independent Ukraine were really not ready to accept their presence on the peninsula, right? The Russian and Ukrainian families had been given their houses, their vineyards, their livestock, their farms. So you can imagine when they repatriate themselves after the Soviet Union disintegrates, they're hardly welcome.
Yeah.
Um, and so they went through a very difficult process of repatriating through squatting on former state property, threatening self-immolation when the local authorities threatened to evict them, and then establishing these homesteads that oftentimes didn't even have um, floors, right? It would be a dirt floor with a corrugated metal roof and some plywood walls. And that situation went on for years and years before they established themselves. So if we fast forward to 2014, Russia has again um, come in and occupied the territory, there are very different responses depending on the age group. I think that, what I heard over and over again from people was that, um, people in younger generations who had gone to Ukrainian schools and were socialized as part of independent Ukraine grew up in a system where human rights were not something that they felt like they had. It was like, unquestionable that they had human rights. And so when they fled to government controlled Ukraine, they saw it as unfortunate, right? But also an opportunity to become Ukrainian in a new way. And that was really instrumental in bringing Crimean Tatars and other Ukrainians closer together politically, culturally, emotionally. New friendships formed, collaborative projects formed. For the people who stayed in Crimea, they practiced cultural resilience, but also, I think that the older generations, um, according to many people, really they had seen it coming and they gave up hope. And there was actually a lot of death. There were people who just gave up hope of life and and died
Wow. Wow, no, that's, I mean,
because they're like, nothing. What good can come from Russian rule? We've seen this
yeah,
one before.
exactly. No, that's awful. So, I mean, Crimea was the first domino to fall in 2014. We've now been enmeshed in this war for the last few years. Why? It feels like Crimea's been left out, obviously, of today's war coverage. Why is it critical to bring Crimea back into focus in the broader scheme, the broader context of things?
Mm, that's a really important question. And I think that the answer really starts with um, the fallacy that allowing Russia to retain its control, its illegal control over Crimea, solves anything. Does that solve anything? Does that make other negotiations easier? No, it does not. It rewards a crime
Hmm.
and it destabilizes the sovereign state system by saying that, hey, you can get away with this some of the time. And so I think it's a disincentive um, so I think that it's foundational to ending the war. And then also just from a purely practical perspective, pretty much immediately, Crimea became a militarized base. It became the staging ground for Russian attacks on the rest of Ukraine. And in the future, it could become the staging ground for attacks on the rest of Europe. So basically, Ukrainian sovereignty and security, European sovereignty and security depends on eventually wresting the Crimean Peninsula from Russian control. Um,
Gotcha. Yeah, so I mean, how do the Crimean Tatars, and you sort of alluded to this earlier, with the two groups, the Ukrainians and the Tatars, sort of discovering each other in this sort of new fashion. How are the Crimean Tatars understanding their own role in the broader Ukrainian struggle for sovereignty?
Crimean Tatars understand that their role is really integral. And to quote a person that I interviewed, um, she spoke about how, before the 2014 occupation, people in Crimea had a strong regional identity, but they didn't really think of themselves as citizens of any state because Crimea is really more like an island than it is a
Mhm.
peninsula, right? It's difficult to get to, relatively isolated. And so, as she put it, after the 2014 occupation, she understood that she's both Ukrainian and Crimean Tatar, right? And so it really represents like a melding. And this is important for Ukraine as a whole because Ukraine moved away from a national idea based on ethnicity to one that's based on democratic governance,
Yeah.
right? That has much more space for people of different ethnic backgrounds and religious belonging. And so they see themselves as integral to the Ukrainian polity. And yeah, I think that that's kind of the gist of it.
Gotcha. So, in all the conversations that you've had, were there any particular moments or voices that really stuck with you? Something that sort of reshaped how you view the Russia war against Ukraine?
Mm,
Like, was there like an aha moment, as you conducted so many of these interviews, had so many of these conversations that did rejigger that understanding?
yes, there's two.
Hmm.
The first was I had the privilege of interviewing Jamala, the 2016 Eurovision winner.
Okay.
And in our, private one-on-one interview, she won basically with a song that explores her great grandmother's experience in those crowded train cars, experiencing the deportation when she realizes that her infant daughter has died in the train car. And I asked her why she took the artistic approach of, seeking to very authentically sort of reanimate that great grandmother, embody that great grandmother. And she said, for the sake of emotion. And I think that what she intuited was this really profound connection between um, public grieving of past losses and political community. She had this sense that if Ukrainians um, could collectively grieve their mutual losses under the Soviet Union, that they would form a much stronger political community. And so for the Ukrainians, right, um, it's the state imposed famine. For Crimean Tatars, it's the deportation. Most Ukrainians didn't know about the deportation until Jamala's song sort of broke that truth on an international stage, and they began to empathize with one another in such a way that Crimean Tatar lives suddenly became grievable. No longer could it be assumed that they were people that could simply be tossed out of train cars. They started to matter in at a emotional level, an empathic level, right? She generated empathy
Yeah.
across the Ukrainian population. And she said, she did this for the sake of emotion. She wanted Ukrainians to feel something of what her people had felt. She didn't have a political project. She had an emotional project to generate um, this mutual recognition. So that was one moment that was very aha for me. And I almost titled the book For the Sake of Emotion because
Mm.
I was so moved by that. And it's like how to transform a society not with force, but from the inside out, right? Like she
Yeah.
had that vision. So that's one moment. And then I think another moment was I also have had the privilege to work with one of the Crimean Tatars leaders whose name is Mustafa Jamiliev. He led the national movement for repatriation, and I got to know him, when I first started working on Crimea. And then we met again after the Crimea was occupied in Kiev. And he said something to me in both interviews, spaced out by what, 15 years, which was that the Crimean Tatars for centuries had found themselves wedged between hegemons, none of whom promised them either protection or relief. And so, in that kernel of truth, of being a small numbered, marginalized people, arises the value of Indigenous status. And so I argue in the book that Indigenous status as a legal category with the Declaration stands to mitigate some of the pathologies of the sovereign international state system that we're operating in, because it's based on territory, not your appearance. It's based on human rights. And so I think of it as this legal status that could afford Ukraine a framework for addressing the challenges that it will face in the future, when it comes to rights, resources, and respect across the Ukrainian population.
So, to round this conversation out with my last question, what's something about the Crimean Tatar experience that you think international observers still miss or misunderstand?
Mm. It's really surprising, but um, something that is frequently missed by both scholars and political leaders and just ordinary people is there's a confusion between the size of a population and its moral importance, right? And so what I hear from even Ukrainian scholars of Ukraine is that, well, the Crimean Tatars are only 12 to 13% of the population of Crimea. And if you look at the population of Ukraine as a whole, they're less than 1%. So we'll address their concerns later, right? That's the argument, is that they're not numerous enough to warrant greater attention. And what I try to argue in the book, or what I do argue in the book, is
Mm-hmm.
that confuses a numerical issue and a moral issue, right? Like in Germany, the Jews were less than 1%. And nobody would ever tell you that that means that we shouldn't be concerned about the Holocaust of European Jewry during World War II, right? We shouldn't be concerned about that. So their percentage of the population is a reflection of a series of policies, Russian imperial, Soviet state, and independent Ukraine. It's a cumulative result of those policies that there's never been a process of restorative justice for the property, the losses, right? And I think that the European Union is laudably now embarking on the accountability piece of transitional justice, but it has to do that in a way that takes into account the Crimean Tatars as part of Ukraine as a whole. And the book is just trying to say that when we look at modern Ukraine, it's important to see the Crimean Tatars as a part of that whole.
Dr. Greta Uehling, thanks so much for joining me here today. This was a great conversation. For our audience, her book, Decolonizing Ukraine, is out. I'll have a link to it in our episode description. But Dr. Uehling, thanks so much for bringing light to the plight of the Crimean Tatar people. It's a very important topic, and I think it's a very it's very much still invisible to so many people around the world. So thanks for doing the work you do.
Thanks for having me.